Yeti Airlines Flight 691 crashed while trying to land, killing all 68 passengers and 4 crew members, making this the worst aviation disaster in Nepal in the last 30 years. So how did two highly experienced captains crash on this short 25-minute flight in clear weather conditions, and what can be done to prevent something like this from happening again? Captain Anju Kadiwada was in the left seat and was the pilot flying, and Captain Kamal KC was in the right seat as the pilot monitoring. Sadly, the whole reason Captain Anju started flying was because back in 2006, her husband was flying a Twin Otter for Yeti Airlines when he crashed and died. Now, she turned that tragedy into her motivation, and as a single mother, she used the insurance money to become a pilot, and she actually did her training in the US before going back to join Yeti Airlines in 2010 as one of only 6 female pilots employed by the airlines. She upgraded to junior captain in 2017 and then became a full-time captain in 2019 and had almost 6,400 hours. Captain Kamal KC was an instructor pilot with almost 22,000 hours of flight time, and the reason he was on this flight was because this was supposed to be an airport familiarization flight for Captain Anju, and this is going to play a big role in what happened that day. Flight 691 is actually the third flight of the day for these two pilots. They had started the day flying from Kathmandu to Pokhara and back, and were now flying to Pokhara for the second time. The reason for the airport familiarization was because the Pokhara airport had just opened up only 2 weeks prior to their flight. Now, flying in Nepal can be challenging at times due to the high elevations of the airports, the mountainous terrain, and the sometimes challenging weather. What's interesting about this airport is that it opened on January 1st, 2023, and it was built with a loan from China, and the Chinese embassy tweeted on opening day that the airport is designed and built to Chinese standards, which reflects the high quality of Chinese engineering. The reason that this is notable is because the airport has one runway oriented northwest to southeast, and that's runway 1230. The problem is there's a lot of terrain around the airport. In fact, you can see one of the hills in this picture that they had to cut down. Now, because of the high terrain and the requirements for safety if an airplane loses an engine, the airport has a one-way approach system and can typically only allow jet aircraft to take off or land on runway 30. The other problem is that at the time of the crash, there wasn't an ILS installed at the airport. Now, this is a system that pilots use to help align the aircraft laterally and vertically with the runway in bad weather conditions, and they also use it in clear weather as a backup for flying a visual approach, or oftentimes the problem in Pokhara isn't the weather, but the bad pollution that might prevent the pilots from being able to see the runway. So even for two highly experienced captains, there were a few challenges to flying into this airport, which is why the familiarization flight was required. On the first flight of the day into the airport, the pilots landed on runway 30, which is basically a straight shot from Kathmandu. Now, I couldn't find any information on this flight, but my guess is that it might have been flown by Captain KC because he was the instructor and he likely was demonstrating the arrival and the approach to landing on runway 30. And my guess is that the plan was always for Captain Kadiwada to fly the third flight, which was the one from Kathmandu back into Pokhara again, and then she would be signed off and qualified for flying into that airport. According to the preliminary accident investigation, the flight departed at 10:32 local time and was supposed to land about 25 minutes later. The weather was VFR, meaning it was good enough to see and fly visually. They were flying an ATR-72 aircraft, which I think is the only type of aircraft that Yeti Airlines flies. Now, this is a 70-seat twin-engine turboprop, so the airplane was basically at full capacity for the flight with 68 passengers and the 4 crew members. The takeoff, climb, cruise, and descent phase of the flight to Pokhara was normal. As they began descending towards the airport, air traffic control assigned them runway 30 for landing, but at some point shortly after that, the pilots requested to land on runway 12. The reason why this runway change is significant is because the problem with a short flight like this is that if you aren't familiar with the airport or the approach, then it's very easy to get behind the aircraft. And that's just a pilot's way of saying that you become overtasked and you're struggling to catch up. And one of the best ways to mitigate that is to first recognize when you have a short flight, and you just go ahead and while you're still on the ground prior to taking off, you can review and brief the approach and landing as well as any threats that you might encounter. Now it's possible that because Captain KC had flown an approach to runway 30 on the first flight of the day, that they planned on Captain Anjou flying an approach to runway 12 for her leg back to Pokhara. However, it's also possible that they never talked about this and instead decided at the last minute that they might as well do an approach to runway 12 so that way she can see what it's like arriving to the airport from the other direction. But since we don't have any of the voice transcripts, here's what we do know. At 10:51:36, the aircraft descended from 6,500 feet and was 5 miles away from the airport when they joined the downwind track for runway 12, and that means they're just flying to the north of the field parallel to the runway, and they're planning to make a circling left-hand turn to land on runway 12. There is no audio transcript for the next few minutes, but we know that at 10:56:12, the flaps are lowered to 15 degrees and the landing gear is also lowered in preparation for landing. 15 seconds later, at 10:56:27, the pilot flying disengages the autopilot, and 5 seconds later, at 10:56:32, she calls for flaps 30. Now, when she makes that call, according to the audio transcript, the pilot monitoring responds flaps 30 and descending. Now, pay attention to the timestamps as we walk through this, because at this point, they only have 60 seconds to live. We have to make a few assumptions about what happened in these final seconds, but we also want to be respectful of the pilots until the full investigation is complete. At 10:56:32, when she makes that call for flaps 30, it's the job of the pilot monitoring to move the flaps. And even though he says flaps 30 and descending, the flaps don't move. Instead, the flight data recorder shows that the propeller rotation speed of both engines decreases to less than 25%, and the torque starts decreasing towards zero. This is consistent with both propellers going into a feathered condition. This is where the angle of the propeller changes approximately 90 degrees in order to minimize drag and stop engine rotation. But the only time you would ever do this in flight is if the engine fails or needs to be shut down. So how did this happen, and what happens in the final seconds that might have changed the outcome of this mishap? I think what's happening right now when she calls for flaps 30 is both pilots are looking outside and no longer maintaining a good instrument cross-check. Now she's the pilot flying, so she has to look outside to fly the plane and set the proper spacing. And that's why the pilot monitoring should be more focused inside on the instruments with periodic glances outside. But pay attention to what both pilots say and do in these last seconds and let me know your opinion. But first, let's talk about the flaps. Check out this center console. You've got the parking brake on the left side, then you have the throttle for each engine, then the propeller condition levers, and then the white lever is the flaps control. Now because all of these controls are right next to each other, they're each designed slightly differently, so that way you don't accidentally move the wrong one. The flap handle has a very distinctive white color and it's shaped kind of like a wing, and you actually have to pull up on the lever to move it back and lower the flaps. The propeller condition levers are black, they're numbered, and they have finger lifts on the front of them which have to be lifted up in order for the levers to slide back to the feathered position. And my guess is that because the pilot monitoring is so focused on looking outside trying to monitor the other pilot, that when she calls for flaps 30, I think he simply reaches down and grabs the prop levers instead of the flap lever, and he pulled the props back to the feathered condition. Normally you would think that both pilots would be able to feel the loss of thrust. However, I think that because they are descending to land and they're so focused on looking outside that it's possible they don't notice that sensation. This is why the job of the pilot monitoring is so important, because he's the one that should be monitoring the instruments and backing up the pilot flying. As soon as the prop's feathered, he should have seen the torque gauge drop to 0 and the NP, which is the propeller speed, drop below 25%. However, when it comes to the pilot flying, her job is to also verify that the flaps go to where she wants them when she says flaps 30. Now she could look down at the flap handle, but there's actually a flap indicator on the center console. And unfortunately, because in the audio transcript she never mentions the flaps again, we can assume that she never actually verifies the position of the flaps. What's interesting is that right after the pilot monitoring says flaps 30 and descending, at 10:56:36 there was a single master caution chime in the cockpit, but the pilots don't talk about it. Now my guess is the master caution is due to the props being feathered, and I'm assuming that they don't even recognize it because this is the same time that they begin a before landing checklist and they're starting a left turn onto the base leg. Unfortunately, the before landing checklist does not include verifying the position of the flaps. Now if it did, the pilot monitoring probably would have caught the mistake. At time 10:56:50, there's an aircraft-generated radio altitude call-out for 500 feet, and a click sound is heard. It's possible that the click sound was one of the pilots pushing the master caution button to extinguish the light, but regardless, at this point, the pilot flying asked the pilot monitoring if she should continue the left-hand turn, and he says to continue the turn. Then she asks him if she should continue to descend, and he responds saying that it's not necessary, and instead he just instructs her to apply a little bit of power. This back and forth conversation only lasts a few seconds, but in my opinion it highlights how focused both pilots are looking outside the cockpit right now. At time 10:56:54, there is another click sound heard, followed by the flaps being moved to the 30-degree position. To me, this indicates that the pilot monitoring noticed that the flaps weren't where they were supposed to be, and so he decides to fix them. But for some reason, he doesn't catch that the props are feathered, and he doesn't say anything to the pilot flying about moving the flaps. I think perhaps he just notices the flap indicator, and again, he's looking outside, so he just reaches down without looking to move the lever, and he doesn't think to check on anything else. At time 10:57:07, air traffic control clears them to land on runway 12, and the pilot flying mentions twice that there is no power coming from the engines. And then at time 10:57:11, she advances the throttles to 62 degrees and then to the maximum power position. Unfortunately, the aircraft is still not responding due to the props being feathered. They're now below 500 feet and descending, but the first time that she had mentioned there was no power, if they wanted to fix things and the terrain clearance allowed for it, they should have just rolled out because you lose more lift in a turn, and they might have been able to continue a straight ahead shallow descent in order to maintain airspeed while analyzing the problem. Regardless, the pilot monitoring should have looked at the engine instruments at some point and caught the error and directed a corrective action. However, none of that happens, and at time 10:57:18, she hands over control of the aircraft to the pilot monitoring, and she states yet again that there is no power coming from the engines. At 10:57:24, the stick shaker was activated. Now this means the aircraft is approaching or already in a stalled condition. Then at 10:57:26, the aircraft banks abruptly to the left and a radio altitude alert for 200 feet is heard. And at 10:57:32, the aircraft impacts the ground with the props still in a feathered condition. It was a very unfortunate and tragic ending to the flight, and I think this highlights the importance of the role of the pilot monitoring, and I also feel like there were a few opportunities to recover from the mistake, but both pilots were just too fixated outside trying to fly the approach. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.